The rise of both of these figures during 1989 and 1990 paralleled a growing disaffection with the Director General. According to several respondents, Rossi had grown increasingly aloof from the Brotherhood's membership and was deeply resented for the attention he lavished on Epiphany magazine and St. Michael the Archangel family schools. This resentment was amplified by Rossi's perceived inattention to administrative details, unwillingness to respond promptly to letters and phone calls, unwarranted meddling in members' personal affairs, and his alleged harsh verbal assaults on those who opposed him. With the movement's embrace of the fiercely penitential Russian monastic tradition, members for the first time permitted themselves to believe that if all are sinners, including their vicar. Word also began to filter out that the Rossis enjoyed a standard of living far beyond that of most Brotherhood families. Their children took ballet lessons, had private tutors, and enjoyed pet ponies. The family's meals, which included such yuppie foods as Genoa salami, fine cheeses, marinated artichoke hearts, Hawaiian liqueurs, and Calistoga water, were served to them by order personnel. Many of those who worked around the Rossis came to believe that the one reason they lived at the Forestville Abbey was to serve their family. Those who could not do so with a smile were soon sent packing. As word spread of the Rossis' alleged abuses of privilege, the couple began to receive a torrent of personal letters confronting them with their sins. With authority in the movement shifting to Podmashensky and Pangratios, a small faction of priests decided it was time to confront the vicar publicly with the Brotherhood's growing criticisms of his leadership. This confrontation took place in a series of 1990 Apostolic Council meetings, during which it was suggested that Rossi step back from his administrative duties while continuing in his role as spiritual director. Rossi, who as the group's acknowledged Gnostic revelator was not used to open criticism, was at first highly offended by the suggestion that he was a poor administrator. In time, however, he withered under the mounting barrage of criticism. At an Apostolic Council meeting on May 25, 1990, the vicar, with the blessings and support of His Eminence Pangratios, stated his intention to withdraw from administrative duties for 1 year. With Rossi's temporal influence thus effectively limited, CSB sought to address some of its pressing organizational problems. The most serious of these concerned the Brotherhood's financial solvency, which was now in question because of another exodus of families from the renunciate Brotherhood. This loss of income-producing members, coupled with the growing unwillingness of local centers to tithe to a central administration viewed as inept and unresponsive, resulted in a precipitous loss of movement income between 1988 and 1990. By May 1990, the group's central offices were operating at a deficit of $9,500 a month. To make matters worse, a growing number of laicized members were demanding lump sum payments from the corporation's coffers to help them set up private households. In response to these economic difficulties, the movement held open Apostolic Council meetings around the country in 1990 and 1991. During these gatherings, the members attempted to hash out the disposition of the group's assets and its future governance. After nearly a year of deliberations, the council approved a complete decentralization of CSB's temporal administration. Local vowed centers under the new regime assumed complete responsibility for their members' material requirements. Members were given the option of tithing to either central headquarters or their local parishes, and they were directed to deposit all tax refunds into local accounts. A mechanism was also developed whereby members who wished to become financially autonomous could receive monetary support over a transition period. With this separation of the Brotherhood's common life from the corporation, the Board of Directors and the Apostolic Council were seen to be redundant. These two bodies were collapsed into one Brotherhood Council, whose 7 members were to be elected from the entire CSB movement. This allowed for both rank-and-file members and women to serve on the group's national governing body. The new Brotherhood Council was empowered to make day-to-day executive, administrative, and judicial decisions, on behalf of the movement. It was also given the task of securing the assets of the corporation and overseeing their proper disbursement. In an election held in June 1991, Stephen Baumann was elected the first chair of this council. During this period of national reorganization, Metropolitan Pangratios consolidated his episcopal authority over the group. Though insisting upon his support for CSB's continued self-governance, he informed the Apostolic Council that he would do whatever was necessary to preserve the good order of the clergy and parishes under his jurisdiction. The Metropolitan's first episcopal initiative came during January 1991 with his formation of an archdiocesan council. This body, whose function was to advise Pangratios on diocesan issues, would be composed of clergy and laity appointed annually by the Metropolitan and his Holy Synod. Although Pangratios assured the Brotherhood that the new council was in no way responsible for CSB's internal organization and management, it soon became clear that the council would be the real seat of centralized power over the Brotherhood's now fully autonomous parishes. The first CSB members chosen for this council included Andrew Rossi, Philip McCaffrey, and David Finkelstein. The Metropolitan's second move was to form an Archdiocesan Education Commission, whose duties would be to coordinate the theological training of both clergy and lay parishioners. Pangratios insisted that this commission was needed to provide more professionalized theological training for the Brotherhood's new priests, as well as a proper curriculum for the indoctrination of CSB children. By placing Andrew Rossi in charge of this commission, however, Pangratios also provided a face-saving way for the vicar to relinquish his remaining spiritual authority over CSB. The office of Director General, whose revelatory function was seen to be unnecessary within an orthodox ecclesiastical system, was dissolved, and Rossi was given the honorific title of Director General Emeritus in recognition of his past service. By the middle of 1991, the Education Commission had instituted a complete program for the training of priests and deacons, as well as a curriculum for catechetical and Sunday school instruction. The main objectives of the clerical training were to engender a greater identity between CSB and the Archdiocese of Vassiloupolis and a greater professionalism in the Brotherhood's clergy. This latter objective was a response to accusations within the larger Orthodox community that CSB's clergy had not received a proper theological and pastoral education. Abbot Podmashensky was given a leading role in these educational enterprises and ceded the Forestville property, which was renamed St. Paisia's Abbey, as a venue for conferences and workshops. In a further sign of CSB's growing accommodation to the professional standards of mainline clergy, many of the group's priests entered divinity programs at accredited colleges and universities. Andrew Rossi, to take one notable example, earned a Master of Divinity degree at the University of San Francisco in 1991. Then, in response to a purported revelation received by Podmashensky, he began to consider taking a doctorate in patristics at Oxford University. In a letter to the Brotherhood Council, Rossi detailed the total costs of his proposed graduate education, $50,000 per year. This amount would cover tuition, books, living expenses for himself and his family, and travel to England. Rossi claimed that his education at Oxford was not his own idea, but the result of a number of coincidences that had convinced him it was God's will. In a subsequent letter, he acknowledged that the idea seemed impossible, impractical, and too expensive to many. Yet the Brotherhood Council had supported his plan as part of its overall educational mission. In doing so, the Council had made an act of faith that would release spiritual grace. Moreover, Rossi had poured out his life for the past 22 years for the Brotherhood, and, if he was supported in his doctoral studies, would continue to commit himself to the spiritual education and ideals of CSB. After a flurry of letters both supporting and attacking the Rossi grant, John McCaffrey declared in an open letter to CSB that if All it costs is $250,000, the total projected cost of Rossi's education, to do a good deed in return for real or imagined injury and injustice, and by doing so we break the hold of evil. I'll call it cheap at the price. This letter from the Brotherhood leader who had led the efforts to dethrone Rossi seemed to bring matters to an uneasy resolution. Rossi was formally accepted by the University of Oxford for entry in the fall of 1991 and moved with his family to England in the late summer. He has since studied under the respected patristic scholar Callistos Ware and been able to maintain the comfortable lifestyle to which he and his family had grown accustomed. Pangratios' next assertion of episcopal authority came with his appointment of 3 Brotherhood priests, Phillip Tolbert, Jacob Myers, and Michael Oyer, to help him administer CSB parishes. These priests acted as liaisons between the metropolitan and local parishes on such matters as diocesan assessments, $10 per person per year according to Rossi's agreement with Pangratios, the registration of baptisms and marriages, divorce petitions, and the special pastoral and economic needs of individual members. Pangratios also asked that all CSB priests submit to him a quarterly report detailing the services they had performed, baptisms for example, and any problems arising from the exercise of their priestly responsibilities. At the October 1990 Apostolic Council meeting in Portland, members discussed the group's need for a new statement of mission now that it had officially renounced its occultic past. Out of these discussions came a consensus that CSB's long pilgrimage through the spiritual fashions of the 1960s and 1970s had providentially prepared it to evangelize the New Age movement. CSB's new mission would thus be to live and promote the Orthodox ascetic tradition so that New Agers might be converted to the saving reality of Jesus Christ. By summer 1991, almost every vowed member of the Brotherhood was either laicized or planning to become laicized. At a series of meetings, a decision was reached that in effect dissolved the Renunciate Brotherhood as a separate entity within CSB. In the future, those who were drawn to a monastic lifestyle would join the St. Herman of Alaska Brotherhood and live at convents or monasteries in Platina, Santa Rosa, Indianapolis, or Spruce Island. All other members would become independent parishioners in the movement's local churches, equal in status to former Christian community and lay order of disciples members. The Brotherhood Council would exist mainly to administer the group's collective assets, which would be used for missionary and service work. A subsequent chapter of the Brotherhood's monumental struggle to resurrect the sacred primordium of early Christianity began in 1991, when a group of its clergy, together with Metropolitan Pangratios, visited Diodoros, the Patriarch of Jerusalem. The purpose of the visit was to establish provisional ties with the Patriarchate, which was viewed in CSB circles as having remained unpolluted by the historical squabbling between Orthodox jurisdictions. The pilgrims attended Divine Liturgy at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and received communion from Metropolitan Amvroisios, an associate of the Patriarch. Pangratios himself was given a direct audience with Diodoros, an event interpreted within CSB as implicit recognition of his episcopal rank. During Easter 1991, Patriarch Diodoros sent a pastoral letter to Pangratios in which he thanked the Metropolitan for his efforts to raise money for the upkeep of Holy Land shrines. The Patriarch also sent Pangratios 3 gifts, each of which the Metropolitan presented to CSB at an Apostolic Council meeting in April. The first of these gifts was an embroidered and beaded Easter egg, which was immediately enshrined in the Church of the Holy Resurrection in Boston. The second gift was a Paschal candle emblazoned with icons of the resurrection of Christ. This candle had been used to receive the first transfer of the Holy Light during the Patriarch's annual Easter Vigil. The third gift was a box of 100 monastic beeswax candles from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which were distributed to parishioners in Boston prior to a special reenactment of the Jerusalem Easter Vigil. Pangratios then ordered that the church's lighting be extinguished and that the assembled priests and deacons encircle him at the altar. One by one he lit their tapers with the Paschal candle, and they in turn lit the tapers of the parishioners. As reported around the country in the Apostolic Council report of April 20 25th to 27th, this mystical ceremony was felt to unite the parishioners with the light of Christ from his sacred tomb. The rite also aptly symbolized the Brotherhood's long search for a light mysticism secured by tradition from the spiritual delusion of the late 20th century. Conclusion. As the introduction to this study suggested, the history of the Holy Order of Man's / Christ the Savior Brotherhood can be profitably viewed as a sophisticated text open to multiple levels of interpretation, analysis, and meaning. Before entering into my own exegesis of this text, however, it is instructive to consider a sampling of the ways that both members and ex-members interpret the Brotherhood's history. The diversity of these interpretations discloses the complex web of ideals, myths, motives, struggles, and disappointments that underlie the remarkable 25-year narrative. Many who remained a part of the movement throughout its journey to orthodoxy have come to recognize the radical nature of the Brotherhood's transformation. As one priest expressed it, what we did was like going from dark to light, in other words, the New Age movement and New Age Christianity. To go from there to Orthodox Christianity is a radical change in fundamental philosophy, not just making respectable something that was wild to begin with. It's actually a rejection at a certain point, and it took several years to go through this, to actually reject the New Age philosophy as a philosophy and to recognize it as false. So we are not what we were as the Holy Order of Man's under a kind of respectable cover now. We have actually gone through a conversion. For this respondent, there was something heroic about the Brotherhood's willingness to tear apart its original worldview and to challenge the legitimacy of its collective experiences for the sake of something that's truer. As a consequence, he held the Brotherhood in great respect. For other CSB loyalists, however, the handling of the changeover has left a cloud over the movement. One of the things that I agree about the Order's journey is that it never stopped and made that statement, "Look, we taught false doctrine. Because of our authority situation, a lot of people were abused and harmed." And you could list any number of things that were wrong that really merit public confession as a way to being clear and going into the future. The lack of that as a bedrock foundational position for the movement's walk into the future really has been a detriment to it because it hasn't clarified it for people the way it should. Several CSB respondents interpreted the Order's journey as a recapitulation of early Christian history. As one explained, we were making the same journey that the early Christian church made. Every heresy that the early church struggled with, we had people teaching. Basically, we recapitulated the early church, both in its good points and in its heretical struggle. A second respondent echoed this perception, adding that the group had felt a kindred spirit to Paul, who was called outside the regular group of apostles and given divine instruction in a transnormal way. Like Paul, however, who had brought himself and his mission to the apostles and submitted it to them, the Order had felt the need to submit itself to the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. For ex-members who have joined mainstream Orthodox churches, the challenge has been to salvage what was valuable from their Order experience. One ex-priest acknowledged that from an Orthodox perspective, the early Order had been a heretical sect founded on a counterfeit ecclesiastical authority. Nevertheless, this respondent found it hard to condemn the Order's past as all wrong, maintaining it's my own history. If I deny that, I deny that it brought me to the point where I am now. Without the whole experience of the Order, learning to live the renunciate life, trying to live in humility, obedience, service, and poverty, I can't say that I would have gotten to orthodoxy. In the final analysis, this respondent still believed that the Order had been guided by a higher purpose and that, for the most part, the intentions of people were sincere. Reconciling themselves with their initiatory experiences poses a particularly thorny problem for members who have chosen orthodoxy, reflects one CSB priest. I've tried to process and integrate all those things from my past, but the initiations were not something you had your hands on anyway. I can't look back and tell you what was subjective versus supernaturally real at those things. My inclination is to feel that they were part of a false mysticism and that they were primarily a subjective event. But by the same token, if you are kneeling and praying that God will fill you with light, then it wouldn't be surprising that He would fill you with a certain amount of light. As far as illumination and God realization, I think that those are Gnostic mystical events that are not really credible within an Orthodox Christian context. Illumination and deification are at the heart of the Orthodox struggle, but they're not cheap and they're not done by other people. Another priest comments, I would classify them, the order's initiations, as what most people would call white magic. White magic is essentially a conscious, deliberate manipulation of certain kinds of things in the psycho-spiritual realm, and it is the association with discarnate spirits and the utilization of those spirits for purposes that are nonetheless essentially benign. As an Orthodox Christian person, these kinds of things are forbidden because of their connection with shamanistic practices. Ex-members who continue to promote Earl Blyton's initiatory system interpret the order's history within the framework of the Western esoteric tradition. According to one such respondent, the Brotherhood was a temporary mystery school created to address urgent human spiritual needs at a time of millennial upheaval. Indeed, in this respondent's view, Blyton had never intended to establish a permanent institution. Rather, the order had been modeled on the fabled Sufi schools of the Middle East, whose missions were to transmit a body of teachings at a certain moment of history and then disappear. Some order traditionalists view the movement as a planetary dispensation that was unsuccessful because of human failure. One representative of this perspective reflects, this was an incredible situation, no matter how it turned out, and the world basically missed it. The world probably always misses these things. I mean, I'm sure the world missed Jesus when he came. People can pick over it all they like and pick over Father Blyton's performance, but Jesus put his seal on it in a way that his presence was there for years. Another Blyton loyalist, while acknowledging the demise of the order as an earthly institution, believed that it continued as a spiritual reality. 20 years ago, when many of us were still coming into adulthood, we were profoundly shaken by a spiritual upliftment of a magnitude unprecedented on earth. We experienced great cultural upheaval as traditional social, political, and moral procedures were questioned and redefined. At the height of this upheaval, Blyton had formed a New Age order to transmit the great solar initiations to humanity. Although its teacher had passed on and its other leaders had scattered to the four winds, the order as an authentic initiatory path was still very much alive. Yet a third old order respondent interpreted the movement as a grand experiment with real power and authority from the heavenly host, whose cosmic mission had been to overcome the inertia of Earth's past conditioning. Because of the urgency of the times, young and immature persons had been pressed into service with sometimes disastrous results. Ultimately, in this respondent's view, Christ had seen that the Brotherhood was not really prepared to fulfill its divine commission. Gradually, compassionately, he took the heavenly power and authority away, and then we were left with our own devices. Perhaps Ruth Blyton best summed up the view of those who continue to follow Earl Blyton's teachings. To try putting into words the spiritual insight and experiences of those years would be to diminish them and to reduce them to something much less than the reality. Because spirit comes from a finer level than anything the brain can deal with, these things can only be experienced, not described. Father Paul was a great teacher and a great being, the most selfless and dedicated person I ever knew. He followed guidance from above in all he did, working to lift humanity to a greater spiritual spiritual awareness and experience. His teachings were both Christian and universal. He did not condemn other religious beliefs, but sought to teach the spiritual truths which are basically the same in all religions. His work was directly with people, seeking to develop their spiritual rather than their mental attributes. Many people were helped through his efforts, but I think his greater work was in laying a foundation and setting patterns for the coming age. Whether or not the organization continues physically, the most important work was accomplished before he left, and it was set to endure. To me, the order in its original form was more than an organization or a group. It was a living spiritual entity, and as such, its soul lives on. If it could be called a cult, so could the group of early Christians who followed this same path. He once said, "I would not dare to have an opinion, neither can I state opinions of what happened after his departure. Only God can know his true and long-range purposes." There is a wide diversity of perspectives concerning Andrew Rossi's motives for leading the order into orthodoxy. Rossi himself, in a 1988 discussion with members in Portland, disavowed his own role and claimed the pilgrimage was entirely spirit-led. "I don't believe that I created this whole business, that I personally set all this in motion. I think it wasn't that way at all. I think it was something that was happening in the spirit, and we were all vehicles of it in one form or another." Others offer psychological explanations. According to one such respondent, Rossi had struggled with a deep-seated need for social acceptance and an obsessive fear that the order would be rejected by conventional religious institutions. As a result, he had worked tirelessly to find a more acceptable Christian identity for the Brotherhood. Another ex-member maintained that Rossi's continuous search for security and respectability disclosed an underlying lack of self-respect and self-esteem. Many respondents were disturbed by Rossi's $250,000 severance settlement, especially in view of the fact that they had received nothing when they left the Brotherhood and were now struggling to support their families. In at least one member's judgment, the settlement smacked of a secret arrangement between Rossi, Pangratios, and Podmashensky. Essentially, the spoils go to Metropolitan Pangratios, Father Herman Podmashensky, and Father Andrew Rossi. The Metropolitan gets a lot of money, Father Herman gets the retreat center, and Father Andrew gets an all-expenses-paid education at Oxford and the beginning of a new career so he doesn't fall flat on his face. Most other people get scraps. Those three guys could have had a meeting 4 years ago and planned this out like that. Although this member admitted the plausibility of such a scenario, he also qualified his suspicions with the comment, "But I don't think they did that. They're good people, each one of them is." Given this diversity of interpretations, how is an academic outsider to make sense of the journey of the Holy Order of Mans? What were the crucial drivers of change and accommodation in the movement? Did the Brotherhood manage to retain any continuity at all with its original sense of mission and identity? And what strategies did members employ to cope with the group's rapid transformation and the concomitant pressures to conform and adapt? The Order's history also raises three significant larger questions for scholars of new religions. First, in what ways is this saga emblematic of the processes of emergence, growth, and conventionalization in new religious movements, NRMs, during their founding generation? Second, what does this history tell us about the primary motivation for sustained member commitment in NRMs? Is this commitment motivated principally by belief in a group's ideology, or is it chiefly rooted in a member's effective bonds with fellow believers? And finally, what does the Brotherhood's pilgrimage to the heart of Christianity tell us about the challenges facing NRMs in late 20th century America? In addressing these micro and macro questions, it is perhaps best to begin with an investigation of the internal and external drivers of change in the Brotherhood during its 20-year lifespan as the Holy Order of Mans. The most important internal driver of change appears to have been the shift in membership profile during the late 1970s from a primarily young, single, and mobile core of New Age missionaries to a collection of married couples in their late 20s and 30s with young children. Coupled with this development was the consolidation of the group's far-flung mission stations into 8 large communities. These shifts in membership, demography, and communal living arrangements led the Brotherhood to replace its early focus on millennial transformation, heroic missionary outreach, and individual spiritual advancement with a radically different set of priorities. These new priorities included the founding of small businesses, the psychological support of families, the efficient indoctrination of children, the engendering of stable, effective ties, and the creation of a self-sufficient communal subculture. As the values of family and community became paramount in the order, the eclecticism and universality of the Blyton era came to be viewed as a threat to group cohesiveness and solidarity. To address this threat, the movement's master teachers began to construct a more united and defined system of doctrines and practices. In the middle of their labors, these teachers came to the realization that the general tenor of these religious system that the general tenor of their religious system placed it squarely within the Western esoteric tradition and in opposition to traditional apostolic Christianity. The leadership was now faced with a difficult choice, whether to remain loyal to their founder's eclectic and esoteric religious worldview with all the risks of disunity and outside persecution that such a course entailed, or to reposition the movement within the time-tested and socially respectable framework of traditional Christianity. Since Blyton had never explicitly condemned traditional Christian doctrines and practices as such, although he had reinterpreted them within his esoteric cosmology, and had used a wide array of Christian symbols, scriptures, and feast days in his ongoing construction of the order, such a such a repositioning could conceivably be orchestrated with a minimum of resistance or confusion. Moreover, since few of the group's members were students of Christian history or theology, and thus aware of the magnitude of the shift that was being contemplated, they would likely be quite willing to allow their more theologically sophisticated leaders to work out the Brotherhood's doctrinal self-representation. Having taken all these factors into consideration, and with the attacks of the anti-cult movement ringing in their ears, the master teachers began to distance themselves from Blyton's Rosicrucian theosophical initiatory system and to remake the Brotherhood in the image of conventional Christianity. With the shift from missionary outreach to community building, a change also occurred in the Brotherhood's conception of its overall mission. Blyton's earlier emphasis on individual and planetary initiatory transformation faded into the background and was replaced by the time-honored utopian ideal of creating an exemplary city on a hill, a wholly religious community that would inspire and uplift the surrounding culture by quiet example. Since modeling enlightened Christian community would now be the group's chief activity, Blyton's system of initiatory attainment came increasingly to be viewed as a troublesome distraction from what the group really had to offer. As such, it became disposable. These developments raised the broader question of whether ideological or affective factors are the dominant motivators of member commitment in NRMs. Thomas Robbins and Dick Anthony have argued that one of the main attractions of the NRMs of the 1960s and 1970s was their ability to function as surrogate families for their young recruits. These researchers theorized that as nuclear and extended families broke down during this period, in the wake of rising divorce rates, increased geographical mobility, and the counterculture's rebellion against conventional social structures, large numbers of rootless youths joined new religious communities because they seemed to offer the emotional intimacy and security that was often missing in both their families and the counterculture. If this experience experience of effective community remained their primary motivation for commitment, it is reasonable to infer that these members would not find shifts in doctrine or ideology sufficient reason to defect from their group's dense network of loving interpersonal relations. Robbins and Anthony's views were echoed by the late Roy Wallace. His study of such groups as the Children of God left him to posit that the conversion of most individuals to these communities was typically not to a body of doctrine, but to the quality of life and social relationships which they found in the movement. The main attraction for these recruits, he concluded, was the warmth and affection with which they were treated by the community and the membership's apparent sincerity and sense of purpose. The evidence from the order's history, including the ease with which members allowed their Rosicrucian theosophical worldview to be replaced by Orthodox Christian doctrines, their tenacious loyalty to the Brotherhood as some transcendent community of chosen saints, the zeal with which they set about during the late 1970s, creating a close-knit communal subculture, and the increasing importance of the group's self-representation as an ark of safety during the last days, supports these scholars' findings. In short, the glue that held the order community together through its radical transmogrification can be seen to have been primarily effective in nature. Ideology and doctrine, though of importance to a few members, many of whom left during the order's journey to orthodoxy, proved to be fluid dimensions of the Brotherhood's corporate existence, easily manipulated in the larger interests of group solidarity and survival. Another important internal dynamic of change was the power struggle that arose in the movement after Blyton's death in 1974, as the master teachers came to the realization that only the Director General's revelatory charisma and iron-willed direction had provided the order with its strong sense of collective mission. They each sought to assert themselves as Blyton's successor and to redefine the group's goals and values according to their own agendas. Within a short time, factions had formed around various master teachers, and the movement teetered on the brink of disintegration. In the years between 1974 and 1978, a shaky compromise was reached whereby each teacher or team of teachers was given a chance to lead the Brotherhood over a one-year period. This revolving leadership brought about an ongoing crisis of movement identity as each teacher or team fought to install a new set of priorities during his or their tenure. When the Brotherhood finally chose Andrew Rossi as a new Director General, it believed it had found the one master teacher with the prophetic and organizational charisma necessary to resuscitate the group's waning spirit of unified purpose. Indeed, the membership fully expected Rossi to assume Earl Blyton's former position as the movement's revelator, mystagogue, and master Gnostic. Rossi, however, had very different priorities and interests than Blyton, and his initiative soon began to reflect this fact. For instance, the new Director General had long been embarrassed by Blyton's rough, homespun style of writing. In contrast to Blyton, who was a non-intellectual folk theologian, Rossi was an erudite scholar of world religious thought, who displayed consummate skill in the discourse and subtleties of Christian theology. When he became Director General, therefore, the former pre-seminarian quickly translated the essentials of Blyton's teachings into the more elite discourses of mainstream Christian theology and comparative religion. In doing so, Rossi forced members to conceptualize and articulate the order's teachings within these more sophisticated and normative styles of discourse. Before long, these discourses had become the approved style of communication within the movement, and the Western esoteric worldview that had served as the backdrop for Blyton's folk theology, since it no longer had the benefit of daily verbal reinforcement, began to disappear. As this occurred, the esoteric doctrines, rituals, and self-representations that had once characterized the Holy Order of Mans also faded from view. A major step on the road to Orthodox conventionalization had occurred. A second significant difference between Blyton and Rossi concerned their attitudes toward marriage and family. Blyton, a divorcee who was estranged from two of his three children, discouraged marriage and procreation in the order, insisting that they would inhibit the movement's ability to fulfill its divine commission. Rossi, on the other hand, was a dutiful husband and father of five who adhered to a highly idealized vision of family life. Once he and his wife had assumed the absolute authority in the group, they championed the transformation of Blyton's New Age mystery school into a religious commune whose primary focus would be the nurture of Christian marriage and child rearing. Both teachers also became active promoters of the community's primary schools for children and enthusiastic orchestrators of courtships and marriages. Andrew Rossi was also far more of a polemicist and rhetorician than the irenic and plain-spoken Earl Blyton. Within a short time of his accession to the Director Generalship, Rossi had authored sophisticated critiques of American materialism, Protestant cosmology and Mariology, and the U.S. government's policy of mutually assured destruction, to mention just a few. By writing in this way, Rossi implicitly sanctioned the movement's retreat from its long-standing prescription against political advocacy and attacks on other religious viewpoints. During the 1980s, Rossi's fondness for theological disputation found its ideal home in the stringent and exclusivist doctrinal traditions of Eastern Orthodoxy. Now, at last, the Director General had an absolutist theological position from which to fire his polemical broadsides. Soon all of the group's publications had adopted this critical mode, and in the end the Brotherhood came to resemble more a warring sect than an ecumenical movement committed to uniting all faiths. Finally, Rossi set a high value on public respectability, in contrast to Blyton's often disdainful attitude towards social and religious conventions. The new Director General was thus willing to accommodate the order to prevailing religious norms if this promised to increase its prestige via the established religious institutions. Indeed, it now appears that one of Rossi's main objectives as Director General was to achieve a respected voice for the Brotherhood in mainstream religious circles. At least part of his motivation for this, in the estimation of his closest advisers, was his personal desire for recognition as a legitimate religious teacher. This judgment is reinforced by Rossi's decision after his removal as Director General to pursue a doctoral degree in patristics at Oxford University. Clearly, the leadership crisis that arose with the passing of Earl Blyton and the eventual accession of Andrew Rossi to the Director Generalship constituted a decisive internal driver of change in the order. From a broader perspective, Rossi's tenure as director provides an apt illustration of the hazards of absolutism in NRMs. He and his co-director wife became widely perceived in the movement as insensitive autocrats who isolated themselves from the real concerns of those they led, and who were prone to equate the welfare of their own family with that of the order. As was the case with other absolutist leaders in the era's new religions, Rossi was inclined to elevate to leadership positions only those who showed a capacity for unswerving personal loyalty. In some instances, these loyalists proved to be woefully inadequate in their roles as administrators and spiritual guides. In the long run, this criterion for leadership led to numerous administrative failures and drove from the Brotherhood some of its most creative and independent members. Another important internal factor in the order's metamorphosis was the religious background of its recruits. Throughout the late 1960s and 1970s, over 50% of these recruits came from Roman Catholic households. The Brotherhood's appeal for these members is easy to understand. It served daily communion, favored a solemn and ceremonial liturgical style, embraced a high Mariology, and had a priestly hierarchy that dressed in Catholic-looking clerical clothing. The appearance, rule, and charitable strivings of its two suborders, the Brown Brothers and the Holy Light and the Immaculate Heart Sisters of Mary, clearly resonated with Catholic orders like the Franciscans and the Poor Clares. Each of these continuities with the Catholic tradition made it easier for ex-Catholics to accept the Brotherhood as a serious religious alternative. When the group lost its footing in the mid-1970s and began searching for an identity within normative Christianity, it was probably no accident that it moved in the direction of a sacramental, apostolic, and hierarchical tradition. Andrew Rossi's own Catholic upbringing and subsequent training in a pre-seminary were also relevant factors in the order's Orthodox transformation. The evidence indicates that the director never lost his respect for the Catholic tradition, especially this tradition's theology and philosophy. In the period before he discovered Orthodoxy, for example, Rossi became a strong advocate of Thomism and even declared in an open letter to Parabola magazine that the only sure way to restore a spiritually authentic metaphysics in Christianity was to go straight through the balanced, harmonious, and disciplined thought of Thomas Aquinas. Had Rossi been able to reach an agreement with the Catholic Church that left the group's organization intact, he might well have brought the Brotherhood under its jurisdiction. Ultimately, however, it was Eastern Orthodoxy's light mysticism, monastic traditions, and willingness to deal concerning the Brotherhood's autonomy that led him to choose an Orthodox identity for the movement. A final internal dynamic of change was the shifting profile of order recruits between 1967 and 1985. The early Brotherhood attracted committed counterculturists who saw in the group's disciplined mystical focus an opportunity to integrate their random psychedelic visions within a coherent religious worldview. These early recruits were largely unconcerned about the group's independent, syncretic, and non-traditional character. With the death of Blyton, however, the order began recruiting members who were attracted not only by the movement's mysticism, but also by its increasingly normative Christian self-representation. Since the Brotherhood sustained a nearly 50% rate of attrition throughout the 1970s, the majority of its members by the mid-1980s had never known Blyton personally, and had been only briefly exposed to the Rosicrucian theosophical worldview at the heart of his spiritual system. These newer members, although they generally held Blyton in high regard, considered themselves part of the Christian mainstream. The group's increasing conventionalization and embrace of Christian orthodoxy was not nearly as difficult for them, therefore, as it would have been for Blyton's first cadre of recruits. External forces played an equally significant role in the order's transformation. Indeed, the Holy Order of Man stands as a paradigmatic example of the degree to which NRMs are shaped by their surrounding cultural environment. Blyton's early order, with its eclectic appropriation of culturally diverse practices and beliefs, its dramaturgical ceremonialism, its non-sectarian and apolitical stances, which embraced the era's hyper-pluralism rather than attacked it, its elevation of women to equal status with men, its privileging of mystical experience and distrust of the totalizing discourses of creed and dogma, its prevailing ethic of service to others, its profusion of self-empowerment strategies, and its millennial vision of planetary transformation, was essentially a child of late 1960s postmodern America. This was an era of cultural criticism and cultural experimentation par excellence, an era when an entire subpopulation suddenly renounced conventional lifestyles and created a counterculture based on ecstatic experience, affectivity, immediacy, self-expression, aestheticism, and the valorization of subjectivity. This counterculture subpopulation projected its inner transformations of consciousness onto the world at large, and eagerly anticipated an age of Aquarius, a greening of America, and the arrival of a new Messiah, a designation claimed by such world avatars as Meher Baba, Guru Maharaji, Sun Myung Moon, and Sai Baba. Blyton's New Age order adapted elements of all these cultural styles and flourished in the innovative, tolerant, and experience-seeking atmosphere of the times. By the mid-1970s, however, the national mood was changing. The dissolution of the youth counterculture into a haze of drugs and violence, the 1973 oil embargo, the fall of Vietnam to the Viet Cong, and the Watergate scandal brought national self-confidence to a low ebb. Gradually, the voices of conservative reaction, prescribing a return to traditional moral and cultural norms, began to gain a wider audience. The country elected a born-again Southern Baptist as president in 1976 in Jimmy Carter, and evangelicalism made a bold attempt to reassert itself as the dominant national religious discourse. The NRMs that had flourished in the late 1960s and early 1970s were now increasingly portrayed as dangerous cults whose chief activity was to enslave and exploit the nation's youth. The Holy Order of Mans underwent its own crisis of confidence during this period, beginning with the firebombing of Blyton's residence in San Francisco, the reception of death threats against him, and the increasing rebelliousness of his closest lieutenants. When the Director General died in April 1974, the movement lost sight of its guiding vision and stumbled through several years of doubt, disillusionment, and disunity. At about the time the evangelical renewal was becoming a national trend, the Order's leadership recast its public self-representation in the image of mainstream Christianity. The late 1970s thus became the era of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's Cost of Discipleship, Juan Carlos Ortiz's Discipleship, and C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. In the wake of the Jonestown debacle and the resulting anti-cult hysteria, the process of conventionalization and Christianization gained speed, culminating in Andrew Rossi's 1980 public declaration that the Brotherhood was Christian in its essence, form, and practice. The national reaction against the anti-nominalism and self-doubt of the 1960s and 1970s shifted into high gear with the 1980 election of Ronald Reagan. The conservative Republicans' widespread popularity seemed to reflect the nation's yearning for the imagined certainties and stability of pre-1960s America. The moral majority and the new Christian right now emerged as forceful champions of such traditional values as patriotism, monogamy, heterosexuality, biblicism, and anti-communism. The Order's trajectory during the 1980s was fully congruent with the decade's conservatism and traditionalism. The group contracted into insulated communities where it sought to preserve the heritage and essence of traditional Christian culture. It also crafted a new identity as the upholder of an integral Christian worldview based on scriptures and patristic doctrine. The Brotherhood's subculture, like that of the New Christian Right, included private, religious-based schools for its children and the revalorization of traditional gender roles. Thus, from its eclectic and non-traditional beginnings in the 1960s to its magniloquent rejection of modernity in the 1980s, the Order appears to have reflected at a microcosmic level the macrocosmic tensions and trends of contemporary American culture. This observation corroborates the contentions of Roy Wallace, Thomas Robbins, and Edward Tiryakian that NRMs can serve as localized indicators of broader socio-cultural upheaval and innovation. A more specific external factor in the Order's transformation was the decline of the counterculture during the mid-1970s and the concomitant drying up of the group's primary recruitment base. The rapid increase in the Brotherhood's membership between 1968 and 1976 had been fueled by the substantial numbers of counterculture youths living in the hippie enclaves and university districts of America's large cities. As the counterculture faded from view, this subpopulation re-assimilated into mainstream society. The youth cohort that came after them was disinclined to join non-traditional religious communities, particularly in the wake of the Jonestown anti-cult hysteria, and opted for more conventional careers and lifestyles. The Order's recognition of this generational shift led it to adopt a strategy of increasing conventionalization during the late 1970s. Another widespread societal condition that had a decisive impact on the Order's transformation relates to what Jean Baudrillard has called our era's domination of simulation. As discussed in the introduction, this phrase alludes to the growing tendency of late 20th century culture to produce a profusion of simulations, simulacra, or images that in turn come to mediate human experiences. Along with this continual production and reproduction of simulacra has occurred the lifting of the requirement that these images have any verifiable relation to the world of concrete facts and experiences. What has resulted, in Baudrillard's view, is a cacophony of random simulations floating through the collective consciousness of a postmodern world, turning the human search for coherent identity into a slippery walk through a hall of mirrors. This cultural trend, facilitated by such electronic technologies as television, digital sound, and computer graphics, has funneled power in our society to those advertising agencies, entertainment and publishing conglomerates, and software and microchip producers, for example, who can skillfully produce, exploit, and monopolize the distribution of simulations. On one level, the entire history of the Order has been a testament to the confusion of simulations that has come to dominate late 20th century America. During its early years, Order members wore Catholic-looking clerical clothing and received daily communion, but were not practicing Catholics. The Brotherhood used the discourse and teachings of the AMORC Rosicrucians, but had no affiliation with this fraternal order. Its missionaries baptized, taught classes, and conducted street patrols, but were purportedly non-proselytizing. Even its leaders were not who they appeared to be, but, it was said, reincarnations of the leading figures of early Christian history. During the 1970s, this confusion of simulations continued. Although the group represented itself as a seminary offering courses in scriptural studies, philosophy, and literature, these courses did not measure up to any recognizable standard of academic content, and their completion earned graduates no accredited degrees. While claiming to embrace the doctrines, sacramental forms, and spiritual practices of traditional Christianity in the late 1970s, the movement continued to administer non-traditional initiatory rites and to conduct Masonic-inspired temple rituals. It also continued to treat its collection of revealed aphorisms as a kind of authoritative scripture and to teach an eclectic combination of theosophical and esoteric doctrines, as is evidenced by such publications as HOOM and Sunflowers. Even the Order's New Testament-based explanation for its acronym was only an oblique simulation crafted for public consumption and its hidden meaning. As the 1980s unfolded, the group began to project an image of itself as an authentic Eastern Orthodox brotherhood. This in spite of the fact that it used only an idiosyncratic selection of Orthodox prayers and liturgical forms, and was never recognized as a legitimate Orthodox institution by the Standing Committee of Orthodox Bishops in America. Even the Order's collective conversion to Orthodoxy, symbolized by the mass baptisms of Easter 1988, can be viewed, and has been by supporters and detractors alike, as a simulated conversion orchestrated by Rossi, Abbot Podmashensky, and Metropolitan Pangratios. The era's domination of simulation was also reflected in the Brotherhood's development of a sophisticated image-making apparatus, which published Epiphany Journal and HOOM, Sunflowers, and Tree of Life magazines, to combat the negative portrayals of the group being produced by the anti-cult movement. Once this apparatus was in place, the Order began to produce subtly nuanced simulations of itself in word and image, many of which did not conform to the true tenor of the Brotherhood's beliefs, practices, and overall self-understanding. This image-making apparatus proved so successful in crafting a respectable public image for the movement that it soon began being used by Rossi to recast the Brotherhood's image of itself. The public representations that members saw being promoted by their leaders between 1978 and 1985 often bore little resemblance to their own conception of the Order. As a result, most members were thoroughly confused about what the movement actually stood for during this period, and became chameleon-like beings, one month parroting one fashionable discourse, the following month another. This state of affairs, coupled with Rossi's skillful representation of the movement's history, left many members wondering whether their own understanding of the Brotherhood had ever actually corresponded to its true nature and mission. In the end, following Rossi into orthodoxy, must have seemed a great relief to these members, since it seemed to offer a coherent and permanent institutional identity rooted in a culturally legitimate tradition. A final cultural condition that had a decisive influence on the order's transformation is the contemporary era's radical relativization of religious authority. This condition is directly traceable to the bewildering plurality of religious truth claims that contemporary information and transportation technologies have made available to the individual believer. Such hyperpluralism saturates, to use Kenneth Gergen's term, the seeker's mind with a myriad of options from which he or she is free to select a religious preference. As Peter Berger has argued, religious worldviews depend to a large degree upon social confirmation for their believability. Since the great plurality of religious perspectives in late 20th century America makes this social confirmation only partial at best, the authoritative status of any particular worldview remains uncertain and in constant danger of being undermined. In the absence of a comprehensive religious consensus, human subjects must assuage their uncertainties by constructing, often with a small group of like-minded individuals, rather precarious structures of religious affirmation. Berger specifies three strategies that have been employed to create plausible and authoritative religious worldviews in these hyper-pluralistic times. The first of these he calls the deductive option. The essential feature of this strategy is to reassert the authority of a religious tradition in the face of modern secularity. This amounts to restoring the tradition to the status of a fact, something given a priori. From this foundation, it is then possible to deduce religious affirmations in a manner similar to that used by medieval Christian theologians. The human subject who chooses this option, according to Berger, experiences himself as responding to a religious reality that is sovereignly independent of the relativizations of his own socio-historical situation. In short, this strategy assuages the uncertainties of the individual believer by providing a seemingly objective criterion of validity. The second strategy Berger terms the reductive option. Put succinctly, this strategy reinterprets a religious tradition according to the values, assumptions, and discourse of contemporary society. It is based on the conviction that for a religious tradition to speak to contemporary issues, it must be translated into contemporary structures of intelligibility. Berger interprets this strategy as essentially a substitution of modern consciousness for the authority of tradition. By making this substitution, modern categories of thought and value become the sole criteria of validity for religious reflection. The major advantage of this strategy in Berger's view is that it appears to reduce cognitive dissonance for the contemporary believer. Its major disadvantage is that the distinctively religious contents of a faith tradition tend to disappear during the translation process. The third strategy Berger calls the inductive option. This strategy depends on experience, both one's own and that embodied in particular traditions, as the authoritative ground for religious affirmation. The option is inductive because it treats religious traditions as bodies of evidence concerning spiritual experience and the insights derived from that experience. Using this empirical evidence, one attempts in an open-ended manner to arrive at a comprehensive understanding of religious truth. Berger claims that the advantages of this approach are its openness to further insights and the freshness of perspective it brings to old issues. Its disadvantage, he concludes, is that it frustrates humankind's posited deep religious hunger for certainty. Berger's three strategies for addressing the uncertain status of religious truth claims in the contemporary era provide a useful framework for interpreting the dynamics of the order's transformation. In its founding period, the movement recruited counterculture youths who had rejected mainstream religion and were seeking ecstatic contact with the sacred through a wide array of unconventional spiritual methods. Blyton's initiatory system was attractive to these youths because it appealed to no other authority than the recruits' own experience. The consensus of respondents from from this early period was that they underwent compelling experiences of sacred power without having to accept any creedal or dogmatic formulations. With this foundation in their own ecstatic experiences, they set about the task of constructing a plausible religious worldview. Because Blyton's students viewed him as the mediator of their mystical experiences, they tended to accept the major affirmations of his Rosicrucian theosophical worldview as authoritative, although they were under no overt pressure to do so. This early order approach clearly correlates with Berger's third or inductive option. After Blyton's death, the frequency of worldview authenticating mystical experiences decreased noticeably, leaving members with the pastiche of religious beliefs, not all of which cohered under closer rational scrutiny, that had constituted their leaders' idiosyncratic folk theology. It was during this period, roughly between 1975 and 1984, that the movement underwent an extended identity and legitimation crisis. Lacking the evidence of an ongoing common spiritual experience to maintain the plausibility of Blyton's worldview, and having long ago rejected the authoritative traditions of their youth, the Brotherhood stumbled through a shadowy realm of uncertainty and insecurity. It tried on one self-representation after another, often within a matter of months. At times, Rossi chided his students for seeking to reify the group's identity, arguing that they must maintain a detached openness to an infinite range of expansions and developments. To the extent that they had merged their identities with that of the Holy Order of Mans, members began to experience a vertigo of overlapping and interweaving self-representations and a gradual slide into schizoid disintegration. It was at this point that Rossi, who was himself beginning to sink into a confused morass of inconsistent self-representations, witnessed for instance his dark apocalyptic pronouncements during 1982 and 1983, came across the writings of the perennialist René Guénon. In Guénon's work, Rossi found a compelling argument for the authenticity of ancient religious traditions. Only these traditions, Guénon claimed, had retained the purity and power of the fabled primordial tradition, the grandfather of all metaphysical truth claims. Stimulated by Guénon's pronouncements, Rossi undertook an exhaustive study of the Eastern Orthodox tradition. As he reflected upon this tradition's light mysticism, he felt that he suddenly perceived the mystical depth behind its formal dogmas. This perception, in turn, likely catalyzed in him a reconversion to the doctrinal certitudes of his Roman Catholic youth. Seen within Berger's framework, Rossi had experienced a conversion to the deductive option. The Director General's students, now desperate to find a secure cognitive mooring for the religious strivings to which they had dedicated their lives, found the new certainty with which he promoted the Orthodox worldview a welcome antidote to their chronic confusion. Orthodoxy, as presented by Rossi and Podmoshenski, appeared as a sovereign metaphysical reality that left no room for subjective interpretation.